we draw this on an economic graph? Now, most likely you've seen this graph already. The aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. It has GDP here, and it has the price level, or CPI, on the vertical axis. So horizontal is GDP, vertical is the consumer price index. This has a measure of both GDP and inflation, two of the three major economic problems that we've talked about. Now, in general, I like to draw it this way. Although a lot of times people will have a vertical line that we'll draw next. But the idea about fiscal policy is like any kind of policy, that GDP is considered to be too low, and the government is going to spend more money to do it. So what do? They increase demand. Spending more money directly means the government demands more goods. Cutting taxes means consumers demand more goods. And so what happens here is that aggregate demand gets pushed up. Consumers are buying more products with their paychecks that are now larger, or the government is demanding more products directly. And what happens here is that GDP goes up. That is how you draw fiscal policy fixing the economic recession. This is how you draw fiscal policy increasing GDP. Now, besides debt, besides the fact that a lot of times this is borrowed money that some people in America don't agree with, the other problem with this is that CPI goes up. Inflation goes up. And the reason why is because if you have more demand for a product, we've seen earlier in this class that increased demand pushes prices up. And so if demand is going up throughout the economy for workers, for construction materials, for anything that the government might spend directly on, you might have an increase in prices throughout the economy. So this increase in demand pushes up prices economy-wide. So now this is, a lot of times I leave it here and say this is how you draw fiscal policy. Now a lot of times books go one step further and they say, well, if prices go up, if prices rise in the economy, doesn't that affect supply? Because you might have seen that shifts in aggregate supply have to do with input costs. That the cost of wages, the cost of materials, the cost of oil, or maybe even the cost of taxes go into this aggregate supply curve. So you can go one step further and say the higher prices affect businesses. The higher prices push business costs up. And so to finish the graph, you can shift the AS curve left until it's exactly above where it was. If you connect these dots, you can have the long-run aggregate supply curve. What this means is that in the long run, fiscal policy doesn't work. It has a temporary boost where GDP goes up, but eventually it pushes costs up. And the end result is that fiscal policy only causes inflation. That's an argument you hear sometimes, that the government policy is actually ineffective, that the government should do nothing other than stay out of the way because any attempt for the government to help is only going to backfire. Right? So if you make that argument, you could say that the government winds up pushing prices up and does nothing for GDP. It only causes the negative effect, inflation, without any of the positive. So that's how you draw it in the short run and then in the long run. GDP goes up temporarily, but in the long run, the rising prices can